As promised, now to mining. Twin Metals' controversial proposal to mine copper and nickel near the Boundary Waters was essentially killed by the Biden administration, who terminated their mineral leases following objections from environmental groups and native tribes. If a future administration wanted to reinstate those leases to then move forward with the permitting and environmental impact process, is this something you would support, and why? Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
I would absolutely support getting the mining going, particularly regarding Twin Metals. I think it's horrific what we've done with the permitting and the regulation. I think it's killing the northern part of our state, and we need those minerals. And the fact is, we've had mining in the northern part of the state for 150 years. If you want to know who stewards land best, it's the people who live there, who raise their children there, who want their grandchildren raised there. We absolutely can mine in the northern part of the state. As far as I'm concerned, we should get government out of the way and let miners mine and let loggers log and let farmers farm. But here's the rub. We're not seeing mining take place because Tim Walz has hooked his wagon to Joe Biden. And I guess with Kamala Harris coming to town on Saturday, he's hooked his wagon to her as well. And between Biden and Harris and Walz, they have absolutely squashed mining in northern Minnesota. It's killed their economy. These folks are like you and I. They just want to take care of their family, pay the bills, maybe take a vacation once in a while. But it isn't happening. This is just wrong. Can you imagine how you would feel if you had this government politician come from hundreds of miles away and tell you, you don't get to do this. The way you grew up, you don't get to do this. The job you want, you don't get to do this, because that's what's happening. We should absolutely let miners mine.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah. First of all, a week and a half ago, I was in Keewatin with the president of U.S. Steel and the steel workers as we made the largest investment in mining in northern Minnesota in decades at the Keetac mine. We continue to make sure that we're following the science, following the law, and following the process. The idea that we just get out of the way, thank goodness I saw a bald eagle today. I'm glad the government was there to make that decision that we could work together. And I can tell you, this idea that teachers or that farmers or that miners don't want to do things right and they just want people out of the way is simply ridiculous. We know that we set standards to make sure that we keep those, and we've done that in northern Minnesota. I've been very clear on all these processes. We will follow the science, we will follow the law, and we will do that in a manner that makes sure that we're able to do them safely and able to produce what we're going to produce. We followed that process in one of the largest construction projects in northern Minnesota, and we know that there's a trade-off, and you have to be careful with environmental standards, but you can create these jobs. So this idea is simply, you're hearing it a lot tonight, what's not happening are complaints rather than real solutions. Watching spades go in the ground up there and watching the Keetac mine now be solid again, making sure that those hundreds of jobs stay there. That's what our administration has done. It's the reason we have the lowest unemployment rate in the history of this country, the second highest labor participation rates, and some of the highest projections of what this state can do. If it's agriculture, if it's medical devices, if it's mining, if we can do so safely and smartly, we'll do it.
And Governor Walz, just to follow up, to be clear, if a future administration wanted to reinstate Twin Metals mineral leases to move forward with permitting and environmental impact process,
we will follow the environmental impact statements. That's what we were doing during the Trump administration. We started, we did it, and that's what's been there. Our administration does what they said they're going to do, and they process according to the law.
Dan, did you ask a yes/no question?
Yes, yes, he did.
And
that was the answer.
And what's your answer?
Yes, we will follow. If they reinstate the mines, yes, we will. That's what we said.
All right. Thank you, Governor Walz. Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Let's get over to Caitlin.
Minnesota has a more than $9 billion surplus. Governor Walz and Republicans couldn't come to terms on a special session to decide how to best use the money. If you become governor, what do you think should be done with the billions in our budget surplus? Governor Walz, will begin with you.
Just with me? Well, first of all, I'm glad that our administration was able to create this. Most of this was created by corporate profits that went through. During my term as governor, we've lowered taxes on the middle class, as I've said. We've created the largest rainy day funds. We've reduced cost in government, and we've been able to do this surplus. I agreed together with Republicans as we signed our names before they walked away that we would leave $4 billion of this on the bottom line. We would put $4 billion in middle class tax cuts specifically aimed at the Social Security tax and renter's credit, and we would put $4 million investing in long-term care, public safety, education, and then get the matching funds for the transportation bill. It was a fair deal. It was smart. I guess they didn't want to get the win on this. What I would say on this is our plan to invest in all the things that grow Minnesota is in a real contrast to Scott's. He made the proposal that he wants to remove the income tax, which the bulk of that would go to millionaires like himself, at the same time taxing Minnesotans for clothes and food. It would also raise your property taxes. At the same time, it would gut the funding to our schools, to our transportation systems, and to things that Minnesota love. This is a real fundamental difference. I believe we invest in Minnesotans. We make targeted tax cuts in the middle class. We're proud of our progressive taxation system and our fairness in taxes, and we make sure that those who are doing well pay their fair share. What we get out of that is one of the best states for longevity, health, wellness, and the other things that come with being in Minnesota. You get what you pay for in Minnesota. I believe it's the middle class should receive those breaks, not the top.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
Well, if you get what you pay for in Minnesota, I guess Governor Walz didn't pay very much for the police, because we've got a lawlessness like we've never seen before. Let's ask ourselves some questions. First off, what's the increase in the budget over the last 11 years? 75%, from $30 billion to $52 billion. Recently, Governor Walz's proposal was, as I've said before, the largest single biennial increase in dollars in the history of Minnesota. That's what he's doing. We have a $10 to $12 billion surplus, give or take. It seems to move around every couple of months. But here's the deal. If we went up 10, 12% during the biennium, and then he wants to spend another $3 or $4 billion, you are now at a 17% increase in one biennium. That is not sustainable. The average wage earner has increased 25% over the last 11 years. Government went up 75%. This is not sustainable. Governor Walz was not interested in having a bonding bill unless he got to spend more. Governor Walz's favorite tactic is to play Santa Claus and come out and say, well, I'm going to give you a check for $1,000. Isn't that nice of me? I would say this: if you would stop the waste, the fraud, the abuse, the cost overruns, and pay attention, you would save every family in Minnesota $1,000. You wouldn't have to be going out pandering like some politician who's trying to buy votes. Minnesotans get what's going on. They understand that it's in the weeks or months before the election that all of a sudden
Thank you,
Santa Claus
Dr.
is
Jensen. And let's get over to Justin.
If I want to give the checks to Santa
30
Claus,
seconds,
Scrooge
Governor
wants
Walz.
to keep them. So there is a choice here.
You get what you pay for.
All right, Justin.
The largest known COVID-19 fraud scheme in the nation was recently discovered here in Minnesota. Close to 50 people are facing charges for allegedly misusing $250 million in funds meant to feed children during the pandemic. My question is, what role do you feel the governor's office plays in this situation, and what steps would you take to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? We'll begin with Dr. Jensen.
Honestly, I think the governor's office was lazy. There were signs right out of the blocks. In fact, Governor Walz said that he was made aware of the situation in April of 2020, but then his office called the news reporter back and said, well, no, it was the summer, he misspoke. And then they called back and said it was November. But it doesn't matter when it was. The fact is the governor had every right to believe that fraud may be taking place with this Feeding Our Futures $250 million. At that point in time, according to state law, he has a responsibility to notify the Office of the Legislative Auditor. He never did that. The legislative auditor has gone on record with a letter saying that never happened. That's breaking the law. Governor Walz and his team could have stopped this anywhere along the line. But when it was getting warm in the kitchen for Governor Walz, because basically it appears that there's a cover-up, two questions are huge on all of our minds. What did Governor Walz know, and when did he know it? And here's the facts. When he was pinned down on that, he said, well, it was the judge. The judge made a bad decision. It was his fault. And then he said, when the judge came back at him in an unprecedented move, he said, well, it was the FBI. The FBI made us keep making these tens of millions of dollars of fraudulent payments because we didn't want to get in the way of their investigation. Then he made a comment about the U.S. Department of Agriculture not having the right program in place. There was a news conference within the last 48 hours pointing out that there were 5 different points where Tim Walz could have stopped this, but he didn't.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen.
This is laziness.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah, all of us can agree that fraud is unacceptable, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. I know when we first came to office, we had the MNLARS system, some of you remember, not fraud, but it was about $100 million of an ineffective system. We worked together bipartisanly to put that in place. We've also implemented those in many of the agencies. We've had many audits by the Office of the Legislative Auditor, unprecedented audit of the governor's office just this year, released in September, as well as the Department of Health. During COVID, the federal government relaxed some of their rules, and they sent out, as they should have, aid to states in the terms of unprecedented numbers. Now, making sure those safeguards are in place, absolute priority. Once the Minnesota Department of Education found this, they alerted the FBI. Now, it's an ongoing investigation. I guess we'll get more clarity once they start to come to that. But I think one of the things that's important here, and I will note, to our hundreds of school districts and to our hundreds of honest providers, you provided food to children at a critical time in a pandemic when there were those putting out false information, internet myths, ivermectin, whatever you have. This was a life and death situation, and food security was a top priority. The vast majority of those delivered and did an incredible job, where Minnesota was ranked as the state with the most security in children's food security. So no one agrees with the fraud. We'll make sure that these people have already pled guilty. They're going to jail. They'll continue to do the investigation. We will continue to put things in place as they've already done at the federal level, rolling and putting back in some of those safeguards. And I think the after action on this is for us to strengthen those.
Rebuttal?
Yeah, I want to check in quick. Was there, you said the governor's office was lazy. Was there a step that you would take that you can stop this from happening again? I'm not sure I heard one from Governor Walz. Is there a step going forward to prevent this, and/or something we would have done differently other than try harder?
I would give this, it's that intersection with the federal government to know where the payees go. I think that can be there. One of the things with the Minnesota Department of Education, when you do these types of grants, there's a grantee agency that then does it to some of the smaller ones. In this case, the grantee agency that was responsible for making sure they were overseeing this was a fraud in Feeding Our Future. So I think one of the things you do on this is working with the federal government. If it's a federal government program being administered by the state, you make sure both the federal and the state safeguards are there.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, 30 seconds to respond.
You just heard a smokescreen. You just heard a smokescreen. This is not about the federal government. This is about the state of Minnesota, and the Office of the Legislative Auditor should have been notified. The fact is, when there was a lawsuit taking place in November and December, there was tremendous opportunity for the Attorney General, for Tim Walz, to look at the checkbook to find out where these tens of millions of dollars are going, and they would see that Teslas were being bought, vacation homes were being bought. This was laziness of the most magnified degree possibly in the history of Minnesota fraud. This absolutely cannot be swept under the rug. There's a cover-up going on.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. We have to move on now. Moving now to our markets, they all cover Minnesota outside of the Twin Cities, more rural parts of the state compared to the cities. Yet in the summer of 2020, we all watched as parts of Minneapolis burned following the murder of George Floyd. Governor Walz, looking back, what would you do differently in reaction to the protests that turned violent? And Dr. Jensen, how would you have handled that situation had you been governor? We want to begin with Governor Walz. You have 90 seconds.
Yeah, first of all, this isn't theoretical. When you're in the room, you have to make the decision. Sitting on the sidelines and critiquing, that's not what being governor is. It's making the hard decisions at the time. The murder of George Floyd shocked not just Minnesota, nor the nation. It shocked the world. And the civil unrest that ensued from that was probably some of the greatest that we've seen both in this nation and globally. And that operation involving dozens of local, county, and then the state, involving multiple states in the region, and involving the federal government, had to be assembled, had to be coordinated, and had to make sure that we brought order back. I'll be the first to tell you, that's terrifying for Minnesotans in those days. Nothing like this had been seen before at the level of violence after the murder of George Floyd. I think, again, there'll be stories written, and this will be written about for quite some time. I'm proud of Minnesota's response. I'm proud of Minnesota's first responders who were out there, from firefighters to police to the National Guard to citizens that were out there. When we got done with this, and President Trump's Secretary of Defense Espers wrote a book, he was on the phone many times communicating with public safety folks here, making the case. His assessment of this is that Minnesota had to write the book on this. They had to build the plane while they're flying it, and it was the model that needs to be used for every state. What I can tell you came out of that is there have been several occasions, from Derek Chauvin's trial to the murder of Daunte Wright, where the potential for this to happen again was there. It did not, because of the lessons learned and the ability to mobilize.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
You heard it here. Governor Walz just told you, I am proud of Minnesota's response, referring to the riots in May and June of 2020. Wow. This isn't a one-off situation. There's a reason that the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association has endorsed me unanimously. Repeatedly, the pattern that has emerged is that Tim Walz denigrated the National Guard. Tim Walz didn't use them when they could have restored safety, security, and lawful behavior. And then, when confronted about it, he made some offhanded comment about a bunch of 19-year-old cooks. He didn't stand with the National Guard. On May 28th, he didn't stand with the cops. He told them, stand down. And at the State Fair a couple of months ago, he says, well, that was because of the best advice of law enforcement, seeming to blame law enforcement for making that decision. A couple weeks after, 3rd Precinct burned. Christopher Columbus statue is torn down. Tim Walz, stand down, State Patrol. Over and over again. Anything that has to do with lawful behavior, it seems that Tim Walz isn't there. And he yet says, I'm proud of the way Minnesota responded. Burn that into your psyche, Minnesota. Arguably, we initiated devastation
Dr.
across the
Jensen.
nation like never before.
Let me
And Tim
clarify.
Walz is proud of Minnesota's response.
And
I
Dr.
clarify?
Jensen, I just want to ask the question again. How would you have handled that situation had you been governor at the time?
The chain of command would have kicked in right away. And we have experts. We have a commissioner of public safety. We have police chiefs in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have Ramsey and Hennepin County. You have got to lean into these people. There were plans. There were methodologies already created that should have been kicked into gear. Tim Walz should have been using the bully pulpit to go down and help be with the people, calm the people. We should not have had TV analysts and TV journalists saying, where is our governor? This was arguably the biggest crisis we've experienced in my lifetime, and Tim Walz was absent.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, a chance
Yeah, I
at a
just want to be
rebuttal.
clear. I said I was proud of the first responders. You may not be, but I was. This was an incredibly difficult and unprecedented incident. There was no precedence for it before. And I want to just be clear. I have stood with the National Guard for 24 years. I'm proud of that work, that expertise that I brings to it. No matter how much I slandered by Scott, it doesn't change the fact to me. I don't care what he says about me. I care what he says about the folks who are out there doing this work, that put a plan together to deal with an unprecedented situation, to restore order in a
Thank
very
you, Governor
difficult
Walz.
time.
He means his 19-year-old cooks is what he's referring to. I
We
think.
have to
Can I
move on
clarify
now.
that? Would you like to have that clarified?
Please.
The question I made on this, of being a soldier and being in this, is that each of us has a military occupational specialty. And Scott, like so many things, took a clip of where I said, one of the problems is in getting folks in right away. We have troops deployed all over the world. We have military occupational specialties that are trained for this. We have a small percentage of the National Guard that is trained for civil defense, not urban warfare, civil defense. And I made the case that some of us are artillerymen, some of us are pilots, some of us are ply chiefs, and some of us are newly enlisted 19-year-olds in cooks or food service. It's an important part of what we do. Having a deep understanding of the military's role and then trying to make the claim that this is somehow slanderous of someone who doesn't understand that. That's why making the case in this. I will be the first to tell you,
Governor Walz,
not everything could go perfectly.
we do have to move on.
Okay.
I see. That's how the rocks and cows, two of them go. Okay, the 19-year-olds and the
And
rocks and cows.
we do have to move along to the next question. Now, Stacy.
Let's address an issue that stands out tonight, diversity. There are no people of color in this debate, either on this panel right here or the candidates for governor. In the wake of 2020 and the social unrest experienced across Minnesota and beyond, where do you think Minnesotans are on race relations, and do you think progress is still being made? This question first to Dr. Jensen.
Well, Stacy, there's not much diversity in the audience either, but I guess that's because we don't have an audience. So having said that, I think that was Tim Walz's choice. I think that Minnesota is absolutely committed to being the kind of marvelous state where kids get foundational educations and they're not judged by the color of their skin. I think you're seeing a rising up of minority communities saying, we're not pleased with this hyper accentuation of skin color. I'm old enough to remember that I was taught, if you see someone who looks differently than you, just forget that and just stick your hand out and make a new friend. We've absolutely corrupted the way we're educating our kids in school. We're saying that somehow some artificial parameter as to what acceptable diversity or inclusion or equity is what we have to hit. That's just not human nature. We need to keep reaching out and making new friends. We need to understand that just because you see two white guys up here on the stage tonight doesn't mean that Tim Walz or Scott Jensen are some racially biased individuals. We need to keep working on it. Minnesota's not perfect. America's not perfect. But when we see an unfairness, we have to go try to root it out. But we don't have to do it in the context of name calling, where all of a sudden, well,
Thank you,
Well,
Dr. Jensen.
Of note, Dr. Jensen, we are confined to a TV station studio here, so for space, there is no audience. Governor Walz, your answer to where do you think Minnesotans are on race relations and where are we headed?
It's a work in progress. It's 160 years, whether it be the indigenous communities here that were subjugated, whether it's boarding schools or land confiscated. We're still working on that. I'm proud of our administration. I'm proud of Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, the first indigenous person to assume an executive office. I'm proud that our judicial appointments start to reflect and look like the state. And I'll tell you what I'm really proud of is our schools. I continue to hear Scott denigrate our schools, black holes, they're terrible, they're not working, and then just vicious black internet rumors about things. That's not who we are. We're a state of immigrants that values that. We have more refugees per capita than any other state. That's not just morally a good thing. It's our economic and cultural future. This beautiful diversity we see out in Worthington when I'm there, you see 50 languages spoken in the school, and you see every storefront filled with different types of foods, different types of businesses that are happening. Minnesota needs to continue to do that. The office of governor can set the tone on that. That's why when Scott said that immigrants are undermining the fabric of our state, that's the type of talk that turns people away. We're going to need to continue to attract people here. We're going to continue to need to diversify. We're going to have to put policies in place that make sure we're attracting teachers of color so that students of color have someone that they understand, look like, think like, see like in front of them, as well as other students. We are doing it in Minnesota, but I can tell you, George Floyd sparked that conversation, and it's
Thank
still
you,
happening.
Governor Walz.
Rebuttal.
And, well, we
I think
do
that
have to move
immigrants
along.
are the
Constrained
fabric
on
of
time.
our.
We want to get to this final question before we wrap up tonight.
Okay.
There are a million topics we could have talked about tonight. We just simply don't have the time. People will assume a lot of things simply by seeing the R or the DFL next to your name. So in 30 seconds, are there any topics where you think your party has it wrong or where you differ from the typical Republican or DFLer? We'll start with Governor Walz.
Yeah, I think on biofuels and some of our agricultural work, I've always been some of an outlier. I was one of the few Democratic members of Congress who was on the Ag Committee. I'm the one who has support of statewide agricultural groups, and there's friends, deep friendships in there of understanding this. And I think our party could do a better job of listening, reaching out, understanding these policies, and trying to find that common ground.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen.
I think, frankly, the Republican Party has plenty of room for improvement, and I'm proud of the fact that we're recognizing it. We need to do a better job of elevating and honoring the issues and concerns that moms have. We need to do a better job of going to the minority communities and asking them what's important, because when we do, they belong with us. They want to elevate faith and family and freedom and life. We need to do a better job of going to millennials and Gen Zs and saying, we need your help solving problems. We need to go to immigrants and say, you are the fabric of our future. We want you with us. Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. All right, it's time to get to our closing statements here. This hour has gone very quickly. Each of you are going to get 2 minutes for those closing statements based on the coin toss before the debate. Governor Walz, you will go first.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank Scott for his participation. Again, Great TV and our moderators. And to you out there, I know there's a big audience out there. I know you care about this state. You get a choice here of a vision of Minnesota, one that questions our elections, one that tells women they can't make their choices, one that defunds our public schools, or you get an opportunity that brought so many of us to Minnesota, an opportunity for a state that is inclusive, an opportunity in a state that, you know what, we do spend a little bit more on health care. We do spend a little bit more on education. We do spend a little bit more on our roads. We've got the 4th largest amount of roads in the country behind California, Texas, and Illinois. We know that you invest in the future. that's what comes back to you tenfold over. Our children are fundamental to us. Investing in fully funding education and making sure they have the best start is what we can do. Making sure we're investing in the workforce of the future. Business community knows we're going to have to tackle this issue. We do have the lowest unemployment rate, and most of our people work. We need to attract people here by being a state that is welcoming, by being a state that says, you know what, we're going to help figure out this crisis around child care. And it's a state that says, you know what, when problems come up, it's not enough just to complain about them. We've seen it across the country, we've seen it here. We should have zero tolerance on crime. We should invest the money that we know we need to invest, and we need to collaborate together. And then we should make smart policies, making sure we keep dangerous military weapons out of the hands of our children, making sure we're continuing to invest in innovation at the University of Minnesota and our state colleges systems and our local community colleges. Those are the ways that Minnesota's come together. I've talked a lot about One Minnesota. I didn't come up with that. That's what we believe, whether it's mining on the Iron Range, whether it's farming in southern Minnesota, or whether it's a job in the Twin Cities. Folks who try and divide us apart aren't going to do it. This is our opportunity to learn from what's happened, to come out of the pandemic, and to create a Minnesota that everybody can thrive in. I hope I can earn your vote.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 2 minutes.
Everyone I see across the state, north, south, east, west, has endured some pretty trying times. I think everyone's felt some heartbreak from watching people's lives turned upside down. And I think everybody has grasped at some level that Tim Walz has failed. It got away from him. He tried, he repeated mistakes, he funneled active COVID-19 disease into nursing homes, he locked down businesses, he locked out kids, he locked in frail elderly. The question is, who's going to step forward? Who's going to try to find a new path for Minnesota? Clearly, we're not One Minnesota. Who is going to help Minnesota find its way back to be the bright, shining star of the North, to be that economic hub of the Midwest? You Minnesotans have the opportunity to do this. You have the power to take back your rights. You have the power to turn your agencies, instead of being heavy-handed, punitive agencies, whether you're talking the DNR or the Met Council, whether you're talking the MPCA, you have the ability to step forward. We need to stand up together. We need to recognize that Matt Birk and Scott Jensen are not professional politicians. We will make mistakes. We will use words that we should have chosen a different word. I will make mistakes, to be sure. But at the end of the day, I will take the slings and the arrows. I will get bruised and bloodied, and I have. I have never had anybody spend $15 million to denigrate my name, but it is what it is. I get it. I've been Family Doctor of the Year, and I've started businesses and built clinics. I've been on school board and president of the Church Council and the Rotary and the Lions. I've always been a measured person. To be called extreme has been an unusual experience for me. But this time around, I want you and I and Matt Birk to stand in the arena side by side. I want us to go forward, and I want us to heal Minnesota.
All right, thank you both. That is our time for tonight. We appreciate Governor Tim Walz and Dr. Scott Jensen for their time and answers. Thanks, of course, to our colleagues from Valley News Live, KEYC News Now, and Northern News Now. Early voting is currently underway, and Election Day is November 8th. Thanks so much for watching.